So you're gonna want to run it there. So the first Tuesday of every month we have a testimony. The rest of the Tuesdays we have Bible study down here at the same time at 7 o'clock. So I just want to get you guys excited. I want your ears to be open, your hearts to be open, and have an open mind to this person's story. He's going to let you in on some crazy stuff that's happened in his life, and he's going to give thanks to God and how he is a walking miracle today. And all of you guys, I just want to remind you, you are walking miracles. You're here for a reason. And so this is part of that reason. So, without further ado, Chris Lawrence.
Testing. There we are. I really appreciate everybody's time tonight. So I've been really looking forward to this. It's been a long time since I've shared my story. Unless, you have groups with me, and I do some groups there. I try to weave in useful parts of my story in order to deliver some things I've learned along the way, not just academically or professionally, but personally from my own experiences with addiction. And, I'm tremendously blessed to have an opportunity to work at the center and run groups. There's something enormously profound about the best part of my job, which is really just getting a glimpse and being able to share in your story with you every time I come into contact with you. And not even just the groups that I'm teaching, but working at the center and being a part of the extended New Beginnings recovery community, just being able to share in this journey, because it has more ups and downs than a Hollywood movie, right? Just being in recovery from where we've come from, where we all come from, up to this point today. I'm going to share a lot about my life, my childhood, and even a bit about the brief moments of the lives of my parents as well, because I think there's a lot to be said about how I came to be who I am from childhood on as a result of the lives my parents lived before I was even born. I've been blessed with being able to experience long-term sobriety, and even been blessed, believe it or not, with having that taken away from me by my decisions and coming through to the other side of what that kind of relapse looks like. And so I have a message, for all of you that are clients, as well as anybody that's working in the helping field today, doing this, because like I said, it's truly a profound experience to be in a professional relationship with people to help promote healing. That's what we're doing this for. So the story begins about 13.8 billion years ago. Okay. I believe God had this plan, and there was a gigantic explosion with creation and destruction swirling together to birth stars and galaxies and solar systems. And, these prominent elements that brought light into this dark void, this mystery that the universe is unfolding in, including elements of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and hydrogen. Did this dance, this creative and destructive dance, to create each and every one of us here. And I think that was God's plan too. So we're the stuff of stars, and it's pretty interesting. That dance, that creation and destruction dance, has been a reoccurring theme in my life, and it's something that I was able to relate to when I got to, I believe, understand more about the mysteries of God and the love that he has for all of us. So it starts, I think, for me, for some context, with the violence of my parents that they were born into as children. My father was born in outside of Boston in a really rough town called Lynn. It had a nickname, Lynn, the city of sin. He never come out the way he went in. So his father was a fisherman, like a lot of working class people were on the East Coast there, a lobsterman, Captain Jack, my dad would call him lovingly. And my grandmother, his mother, my father's mother, Barbara, was a fiery Irish Catholic woman. That when I came to know her as a little kid, she was this tiny little Irish East Coast gal with fiery blonde hair and a little cane. And she smoked cigarettes most of her life. So when I would talk to her over the phone when I was a little kid, she'd say, "Chrissy, sing me Jesus Loves Me." And she kept asking me to do that until I was about 13 or 14. I said, "Grandma, I'm getting a little too old for that." But for my father, one of his earliest memories with him and his little brother, my Uncle Timmy, one of their earliest memories was a Christmas where, my grandfather was holding my grandmother up at gunpoint. And the violence in that household shaped my father's childhood destiny out of fear and post-traumatic stress. My grandfather was alcoholic, so was my grandmother, and she also used pills. So addiction has been a generational curse in our family. My father and his little brother were pulled out of the home when they were 4 and 5, and they were sent and separated and sent to foster homes. And my father was in foster homes probably until the age of 11 or 12, and he was abused sexually in those foster homes. He came back later to be with his mother when he was a teenager, and she was struggling with substance use. Their family was no longer intact, and so my dad would often fill the role of being a caretaker for his alcoholic mother. And oftentimes he would find himself on the streets, and he would be hanging out with gangs in the streets and walking the walk and talking the talk. And he was quite the chameleon, and that was a way that he was able to shield his pain and try to find a way to fit in to the chaos that characterized his childhood. He got a gun charge in New Jersey when he was 17, and the judge said Army or prison. And so my dad went to the Army. So he went to the Army. He was stationed in Oklahoma. So Tulsa, Oklahoma, some years before my father was stationed there, my mother was born in Tulsa. Her father wasn't a very good person from what we've been told, and he was abusive to my mother's mother, my grandmother as well. And their marriage didn't stay intact either. My mother was also sexually abused when she was a child. So they both met at a bar while he was stationed in the Army, and they fell madly in love with each other. And they would ensue into this back and forth of this push and pull, real chaotic, toxic, young love, young relationship. And my mom would take us out of the house as babies, and my dad would win her back. And she ran all the way to the state of Colorado. Well, before I was born, she ran to the state of Colorado from Tulsa, and I was born March 1st, 1980, at Swedish Medical Center in Inglewood, Colorado, just down the street. So my father, of course, was abusing alcohol and drugs in the 80s, and I remember I was 5 or 6 when my father had decided to get sober, and we moved to the mountains just outside Denver in a little town called Georgetown. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. They filmed a movie there in 1986 with John Denver called A Christmas Gift. It was a cool experience because a lot of the townspeople got invited to be extras in the film, so that was pretty interesting. But from what I can remember, my childhood in that picture, in that sliver of time there in Georgetown was relatively stable because my father was sober, and he was an entrepreneur. My father was a restaurateur. He had started a whole chain of Bavarian bakeries in Lakewood in the 80s, and then started up a little bakery, pizza deli in Georgetown. He also published a little dining and lodging guide for tourists. So he was always an entrepreneur. And, we were just living in this beautiful, picturesque mountain town in Georgetown. It wasn't until the late 80s that my dad had an opportunity to start a mortgage company in Denver, so we moved back to Denver toward the beginning of the 1990s. From what I was told, my father had shortly relapsed before or right after we moved to Denver, and we were living in Aurora. Essentially, I had always remembered the chaos that had characterized my childhood, from my father relapsing, as well as my mother and my father's inability really to really create any stability at home. The trauma that they had to deal with, that they obviously carried in from their childhood into our family, really shaped the way that me and my brothers developed. And my mother had a really hard time regulating her emotions. And from what my mother has told me, my father, with his use, was also emotionally abusive toward my mother and really controlling of her as well. So from the get-go, the intensity of that chaos that characterized my childhood, I really didn't have a whole lot of time or even ability to focus on who I was. As a kid, I really didn't know what my place was in our family. And I started to compare myself to my older brothers. I had two older brothers. My brother Jerry's my oldest brother, and we have a different mother. He's from Tulsa as well. He came to live with us when I believe I was 3 or 4, and he was also abused when he was a kid by an uncle, so he was pulled out of that family and away from his mother because she was permanently debilitated and disabled from a car accident they got into when they were kids, when he was a kid. So there's my older half-brother Jerry, my middle brother Sean, and then little me, little Chris. I was the baby of the family. My older brothers, were in gifted and talented programs. They were remarked upon their genius as kids. My brother Sean could read at the age of 2, and I still couldn't even read and share in the fun of reading the Sunday comics from the newspaper when I was 6 or 7. So I was a late bloomer. And my brother Jerry was also in gifted and talented programs, and he was testing early and about on track to graduate high school early. So I thought I was the family idiot, really. I knew my mom was really smart. She was also a talented writer. And of course, I believe my dad was smart too, because he was a self-made man and a businessman. And so I just thought I was kind of the idiot of the family. And that was really my introduction with trying to develop some kind of relationship with self-worth at a really young age. When I was 6 or 7, I had discovered how to play the piano. My mom got my brother a Nintendo for Christmas, and she wanted to get me something electronic, but she really didn't know what to get me, but she knew that I loved to sing, so she got me a little toy keyboard, a tiny little Yamaha keyboard when I was 6. And as soon as I turned it on, put batteries in it and turned it on, I started playing Christmas carols, Christmas songs that I had been hearing all throughout the holiday season. So my parents discovered that we were onto something with kind of an innate talent with me at the piano. My ADHD, or whatever kind of distractibility you want to call it, prevented me from really being able to dive into piano lessons. The piano teachers really couldn't keep me focused. I couldn't handle the minutia of learning how to read music, and they'd get frustrated that I was taking too long, so they'd play me the song, and then I'd hear it and then start playing it, and they'd tell me I was cheating, and so I just wasn't really successful at studying music when I was a kid. So unfortunately, that was just something, my parents, I think maybe lovingly, didn't want to push me to do something that I really wasn't interested in. I was interested in the music. I wasn't interested in the studying. And of course, that was kind of reflective of how I felt about school, too. I didn't try too hard in school because I thought I was an idiot. So fast forward into living in Aurora when I'm 10 years old, and I'd experienced a fair amount of bullying and just not really feeling accepted by my peers until I discovered my humor, and I started making other students laugh. So between the piano and being able to play piano for people and being able to make people laugh, I started to find value in myself and what I was able to provide to people around me. I could provide laughter, and they also seemed to enjoy the music that I was playing. So I began to build what I saw as my self-worth, which was dependent upon those abilities that I had. In Aurora, my father's had relapsed, and his substance use started to get worse. So I was always raised Christian. My father, it was really important in our family. And it was non-denominational or evangelical churches, usually spirit-filled. And my father would make sure that we would attend church as a family on Sundays. His use started getting so bad, kind of coupled with his workaholism, that my father would start to be out for 4, 5, 6 days at a time, but he'd make sure to come home in time on Saturday to get us to church together on Sunday. So I started getting mixed messages about Christianity because I saw that it was there for us when my father wanted to make sure that we were obeying him to make it to church as a family, but then he wasn't with us for the rest of the week because he was out using and drinking. And it was causing a tremendous amount of stress at home. And my mother was stuck there at the house taking care of 2 small children. My oldest brother, Jerry, who I had mentioned earlier, by this time, he had been acting out since the age of 12. He had been breaking into stores. He stole a car when he was 15, got into a high-speed police chase across state lines. He stole a car that was running at a 7-Eleven outside in Aurora and ended up getting in a high-speed chase all the way to crossing the Kansas border. So my brother Jerry was in kind of youth detention services. So he was out of the picture in our family. And my mom was stuck home with me and Sean. And I remember vividly the plan that my mother hatched for us to leave my father. She would have me go up and turn my keyboard that was sitting up in my bedroom and turn it on demo mode so it would play a piano song. And then I would hide in the garage. And then I would make sure to listen for my father pulling up and with the car. And he would walk into the house, think that I was upstairs playing the piano. And I was 10 years old when my mom hatched this plan. It was my responsibility to run out of the garage, go to the running car, jump inside the truck, and because my father always pulled up leaving the keys. He would always leave the keys in the truck. So it was my responsibility to jump in the car and lock myself in the car with the keys. Well, my father was late coming home, of course, so we had all let our guard down and didn't think he was coming home once again this night, but he finally did. So I popped out of the couch, ran through the garage, jumped into the truck, and my dad bolts for the door. He comes out to see what the heck's going on. He tries to open the door. He wasn't violent with me or anything. But my mom comes out, and they both began to wrestle in the yard over the car keys. That was our attempt to try to leave my dad. The police were called by neighbors. My dad was taken to jail. And my mom didn't press charges, but it was that night and into the next day that we did decide to officially leave my dad because his substance use had taken precedence over the family. So my grandmother came down from a little town near Georgetown called Silver Plume. She drove down to take in her daughter and her 2 little grandbabies back to Silver Plume to live with her. So that began a period that was probably one of the most foundational and kind of leading to this childhood pain that would stick around for quite some years up throughout my adolescence. Around the age of 10 is when my family officially disintegrated. And that was really huge for me. That was a really big deal for me. And I would get our family, because we were so poor, we would have to move from little town to little mountain town looking for work, living in trailers, and just having to change schools every 6 to 9 months was extraordinarily challenging for me. I would also remember the communication from my father, receiving that in the form of letters on the yellow legal pad, legal note pad from jail. That was what I associated that kind of paper with, so I won't even use yellow notepad, note paper anymore as a result of that. But that was basically my childhood from 10 to 11, 10 to 12. And it seems like, gosh, it's only a 2-year period, but it seemed like ages to me because the amount of schools that I had to change, and every time I had to start all over again and try to make friends, and still not really knowing who I was as a result of having to navigate all this chaos and constant moving around. But one day my mom, now it's my mom's boyfriend, a couple years later, and my brother Sean were living in an apartment in Georgetown. They're working in restaurants. My stepdad was a cook. My mom was a waitress. And one day my dad comes back into our lives, and he had recently moved to Grand Junction, Colorado when I was about 11 or 12. And he'd contacted my mother saying he had been sober for a year, and he wanted to start seeing us more, having us more in his life, his children. Well, my mom told us a couple years later that this is what was going on with my dad after he got out of jail for those first couple of years while we were moving around. So rewinding just a little bit, in Aurora, he was associating himself with members of the Greek mafia. And he had known some people in Denver that were entrepreneurs, and they ran some hotels and restaurants, and he was there hanging out and getting to know this guy that had a business partner that the guy in the Greek mafia wanted my dad to kill this guy's business partner. So this guy had propositioned my father to pay him $10,000 to kill this guy's business partner. Lo and behold, my father, while he was running amok, already had a pending charge of holding up a Dairy Queen in Aurora, and he was facing 40 years in prison. So what he did is he leveraged that possibility of never being able to see us again by taking this murder for hire to the FBI. And what they did is my dad was so whacked out on drugs at that time, crack cocaine namely, the FBI, after they went through this sting operation with my dad, ended up moving him out to Grand Junction and putting him in treatment. So he had gone to treatment at this place called Colorado West Mental Health in Grand Junction in 1991. So fast forward again, he's sober a year, he wants us back in his life. So I went to go live with my father. And it was quite an extraordinary experience for me, seeing how much my father had changed, and really seeing that this was the father that I had always wanted. He was sober, straight, he was working hard, and he was a mighty man of God with an extraordinary faith in God, and he was a caring, doting father, and I had no idea what that was like. And I had remembered being introduced to 12-step programs because my father was heavily involved in 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous, and he sometimes he couldn't get a babysitter, so he'd bring me and my brother along with him. So I would go into these rooms filled with cigarette smoke and an odor of coffee, and hear men's stories, sad stories of being in this world of alcohol addiction, and then their stories of hope and trying to make a better life for themselves. I was really confused because even though I saw this new man that was in my life that was my father, and he was a good man, I still had a lot of anger and resentment built up for my dad. And I was just kind of a lost early teenager. I was 13. I was a kleptomaniac. I was stealing from stores, stealing cigarettes from stores. Back in the day, in the early 90s, they'd keep cigarettes out in the middle of the aisles, so it was a lot easier to steal them. And also, I would set things on fire. I was a little arsonist, so it wasn't too bad, but I did get in trouble for it. So I caught my first felony first and only felony when I was 13 years old for arson. And my mother tried to argue with the court that it was because of my, chaotic childhood. I even remembered vividly to this day bringing up the argument in court as a 13-year-old saying it was my ADHD, and they were telling me that that wasn't a really good defense to bring in court. I didn't know they were going to make a song about that either, decades later, but that's where I was at. Meanwhile, my brother Jerry, he was getting sober, and he was staying sober, getting his life together, and he was emerging to become a young adult. And he got married, and he started to turn his life over. But that was essentially how my early teens were characterized, me getting into trouble, but having an opportunity to be around a new father that was sober and that was really trying to do this family thing the right way and do it a godly way as well. My father was heavily active in ministry on the side. He started building houses, but with the proceeds that he would make building and selling houses, he would also give to the community, help poor people. He would help people pay their utility bills, and he ended up taking his ministry internationally. He would go to Africa and build schools for children, and he'd go to Mexico and build houses for the homeless. And he would minister in prisons, and he'd go to the Philippines and do medical missions trips out there. So that was really me being able to put my father on this huge pedestal. And despite the chaos and even the confusion and my restlessness as a teenager, it was really good to have this solid rock of a father in my life. So high school was okay. I was really involved in extracurricular activities. I loved speech and debate team. I loved theater. Any way that I could perform, any outlet that I could find for me to perform, that was essentially the way that I best dealt with my crisis of identity, which is what I like to call it. Since early childhood, not really understanding who I was or what my identity was, because I was constantly comparing myself to my brothers, all the way into really finding a comfort level at being a performer and still not really understanding who I was. And I graduated high school barely by the skin of my teeth. They practically had to kick me out of school graduating me because I kept having to repeat geometry. But I was a slow math student. But as soon as I got away from high school, I was off and running. I didn't want to go to college. I just wanted to experience the world and experience life. And I worked for my dad digging ditches for irrigation around his houses he was building for a summer, saved up enough money, and I moved to Greeley from Grand Junction to start my new independent life. In Greeley, I was waiting tables and I was hanging out with new friends, and I had discovered methamphetamine in Greeley, and that had propelled me to a new reality. And it kind of, at that time, when I was first introduced to it, made certain parts of my chaotic brain less chaotic. And the thrill and the ability to continue to escape and not have to worry about figuring out what my identity was pretty convenient for me. And I was just living pretty recklessly. I had gone with two other friends. We decided to get into a car with an 8-ball of meth and drove all the way from Greeley over to San Francisco. I was 19 years old, drove from San Francisco, kept going all the way down to Los Angeles, and I was just there on the streets. And I was just letting my addiction with meth take me exploring all over the streets of Hollywood. And we were involved in some pretty questionable activities out there in order for me to satiate my addiction to methamphetamine. So much so that I was working the streets for money at that time when I was 19 as a prostitute. And one night I was confronted by undercover police officers, and I was arrested for that. And so that really woke me up at 19. I ended up getting served with like 125 hours of community service, but I had gone back to Colorado with my tail between my legs, still, dealing with this crisis of identity. And I ended up leaving Greeley and moving back to Grand Junction to be closer to my dad and try to get my life back together. But I continued to use drugs, and I continued to drink, and eventually I got my first of 3 DUIs. And once again, I decided to go to California after I got in trouble, but this time it was to go to a treatment program, a long-term treatment program out in California. I was supposed to make a year-long commitment there, and I ended up leaving 3 months early, and I came back to Denver, came back to Grand Junction, and continued to struggle with addiction. Finally, after rehab number 2 and DUI number 2, I had moved to Fort Collins to once again start my life over again. And I was 6 months on court-ordered sobriety at the age of 24. Okay, yeah, I fast forward. This is a good 5-year gap here that's really just characterized by substance use, rehabs, and DUIs, criminal justice system. So I decided I wanted to do something more meaningful with my life, and I decided to enroll in college at Front Range Community College. And while I was going to school, and I was in 6 months of legally enforced sobriety, my father was continuing to do mission outreaches to other countries. And by this time, my father had become the largest home builder in western Colorado. And I didn't know it at the time. I was actually pretty insulated from understanding how much wealth my father had accumulated from being a builder and developer. But he was a millionaire, and he was, doing a lot with his money in other countries to help, with the missionary work. While I was going to college, my father told me that he was working with another pastor, and the pastor's daughter in the Philippines was a nursing student. Her name was Christine. My dad had given her my email address. And so while I'm going to school in Fort Collins, I get an email from this young nursing student named Christine with this really adorable broken English, just getting to know me a little more. And through a 6-month period of correspondence by email, I started to fall madly in love with this woman. And it was really awesome because I had this prospect now. I was in school, trying to figure that out academically, trying to see what, was on the horizon for me in my future. And I was in love, and I was sober. So it was a really awesome combination and a perfect constellation of really good positive things happening in my life, where I had made a commitment to stay sober even after I was in the criminal justice system. I was staying sober on my own accord, and for the name of love and the name of a better future and the name of a possible family that I could build. And I ended up going out to meet Christine in the Philippines. My dad flew me out there to meet with her. I also got to help and participate in some of the missionary work out there. We ended up building a children's home out there that was amazing, and I was working with Christine doing some medical mission work too, and I asked her to marry me. And 6 months later, we got married, and it was a beautiful wedding. And I was unfortunately having to look forward to leaving her there in the Philippines and going back to the United States so I could begin this, what would become a year-long process of immigrating my new wife over to the U.S. So I had to leave my wife behind. I flew from Manila, stop over in Taiwan, and I had 364 days of sobriety. And as soon as I stepped into the airport, the first thing that was welcoming me was this big Budweiser poster. And I thought, just, I'm on the other side of the world. I did really good. I had 364 days of sobriety. I'm just going to have one beer. And I fooled myself for a while that I thought I had this thing licked. I thought I could control this thing. But unfortunately, the drinking that I started that day eventually got more and more and more and more. And so my wife comes to finally be with me, and I'm trying to start this new marriage and this new life with my wife, but I'm starting to drink more and more heavily. I start DJing more at the clubs. I'm probably DJing 20 times a month around various clubs and bars. And I was a heavy drinker. I was spending $1,500 a month on average at the bars, on top of the free bar tabs they give me as a part of my payment for being a DJ. And so eventually, 2008, the economy crashes, the real estate market crashes, and my father, of course, professionally is extraordinarily impacted by that. What happened is that my father had built a lot of inventory, and he couldn't sell more inventory unless he got more loans from the bank. Well, because of the real estate market crashing, the banks squeezed up their financing. My father couldn't build more inventory to sell, so he couldn't make good on his debts that he owed the bank. It was a vicious cycle. My father didn't have a plan B, so he ended up losing $10 million, and his business was all but thwarted. My father, being so heavily dependent upon the financial wherewithal that he was given from his businesses to help people all over the world, he ended up crashing and burning emotionally. And business partners turned against him. People that respected him turned against him. And so my father, after 18 years of sobriety, relapsed. So me, I was in the peak of my use. And I knew that something was not quite right with my dad. I had heard a rumor that he had started drinking again. I didn't really catch him. I never smelt it on him. But one day I was over at his office, and I went outside and opened up his truck to grab a cigarette out of there. And I lifted up the center console, and there was a big pile of cocaine in the center console. My heart, completely dropped in my chest because I had put so much weight on my father's recovery, long-term recovery, and all throughout my life, every time I crashed and burned, my dad was there. And the hope that I could get sober, that I could probably beat this thing was there, and I saw that through my father. And then here it was, my father had completely thrown that away. So I was panicking. My father wasn't getting any better. I wasn't getting any better. I was watching a television show one night during the peak of the chaos of my father's use, coupled with the chaos of my use. And I was watching an intervention episode, and I was watching on there how the main person from the intervention show was able to get treatment, but also one of his loved ones was able to get treatment right there too. So I thought maybe, just maybe, if I shared my father and my story with intervention, they might do the show. And not only will my father get help, but I'll get help. 2 birds with 1 stone. Heck of a deal. So I emailed the intervention show, and I got a response the next day. And they said, Chris, we get 30,000 entries, submissions for stories every year. We can only go with 30 of them. And they ended up sending a camera crew out to do an episode of intervention on our family. And me and my dad both got to go to treatment. That sent me, oh man, I can't believe we're almost, I didn't realize we're okay. Okay, good. I've only got 2 more hours, guys. No, I promise. It's not that long. No, listen, so we ended up getting shipped away to 2 different rehabs. My father got to go to Florida. I got to go to this place in Astoria, Oregon. And it was that moment, I was 32 years old. As soon as my foot hit the ground on the commitment that I made to go to rehab, I was sold. I was done. This was it. I wasn't looking back. I actually felt this hunger inside for living life differently and really committing to sobriety this time. And I was hopeful that my dad was in Florida getting help too. So I hit the ground running, and it was a 90-day program, and it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Unfortunately, my dad started conning his way out of an earlier program from 90 to 60, and conned his way out of committing to a full 90 days. And he was getting out after only 60 days. I was in talks with him. I was going to have him come out to Oregon to visit me, and I contacted the show to see if they wanted to do an update. So they sent a tiny little camera crew out there to meet with my father, rendezvousing with me out there, but my dad never showed. So he ended up stopping off in Denver and continuing back on his journey with using drugs and back into my father's life of crack cocaine. So me, I changed my life. As soon as I got out of treatment, I got a job as a restaurant manager, assistant manager at a barbecue place, and I was working out regularly. I was physically healthier, and I was inspired to want to help people, and I started my journey professionally back in 2014 to wanting to work in the behavioral health field. And my father, unfortunately, about 1 to 2 years after he got out of treatment and back into his drug use, ended up getting, I woke up one morning and a friend said, I got a text saying, your dad's in the newspaper. And so I got up and I ran down to the newspaper, and on the front page there were 36 pictures of a 36-person drug indictment my father was wrapped up in with the Mexican cartel, as well as several other people in the community. And he was sent to jail on a $500,000 cash-only bond. Meanwhile, I was trying to pursue my career in the mental health field. I was a case manager at Mind Springs Health, which had formerly been Colorado West Mental Health, which was the place that my father had gone to treatment maybe 15 years prior. And I kind of became my dad's case manager. I was helping him while he was in jail. He was on this essentially no bond, because no one had $500,000 to get him out. And so I was helping manage what little finances he had left to dole it out to his second family, younger family that he was taking care of. He was raising some grandkids and my adopted baby brother at that time. And I was trying to do this sobriety thing and this building my professional life, learning how to become a counselor. I started taking classes at Adams State University, a master's program for counseling, and I was taking an MBA in healthcare administration, because I had to do it up, right? I wanted to not only be a counselor, but maybe one day I could run or start my own treatment center, and so I had to get the administrative and business experience and education under my belt. And that's kind of how it was for me. That's what really characterized my recovery for that whole 5-year period, is this Chris's identity crisis was starting to weave its way back in, because all these things I was doing for my life professionally and personally and for my marriage were positive, but I was once again engaging in this performance. I wanted it to look like on the outside I was successful. And I felt sincerely that I was pursuing recovery and sincere about that. And I had not even a second thought about using drugs or anything. But what became convenient for me is that once again I started to gauge my worth on what other people saw was success. I was engaging the community. I was organizing overdose awareness events for the community. I was writing op-eds in the newspaper about addiction. I was working with community task forces, rubbing elbows with leadership and stakeholders in the behavioral health field and in the community at large. And then probably 3 years into my recovery, my mother passed away. And she died suddenly from a heart attack at 57. So she never struggled with substance use, but she did struggle with never really being able to live a fulfilled life and really break out of the pain and trauma from her past. And she just got sedentary for a 10-year period, and her health deteriorated, and she died from a heart attack. But I did all the right things. I increased the frequency of my AA meetings, and I prayed more, and I, went to counseling, and I was trying to be mindful. I was trying to do all the things that you're supposed to do when life hits you. What I had discovered, though, is that it was really important for me that people continued to validate me and my worth in my recovery. And so if I didn't get the attaboys or the pats on the shoulder, I would start to get insecure. And I just think a storm was brewing with my mother's death and with the problems that my father was having, and with my inability to really have any kind of substantive grasp of my own identity. I was just building a house of cards until a real slight breeze blew it all down. And I pushed my wife out of my life as well. And I think it was because my wife was so healthy for me that despite all the good things I was doing in my life and all the positive moves I was trying to make, my brain was just wired still from this chaos from my childhood. And with this generational curse I got of this violence from generations before. And that's what dictated the way that I saw the world. So this normalcy and this healthiness, even though it felt great, it was confusing, and I didn't understand it. And I think I ended up starting to push away all the healthy things in my life. I pushed my wife away, and I ended up leaving her. And I was dating someone, a young woman. She was probably 21 or 22, and she was quite a broken person, had an extraordinarily horrible, abusive childhood, and but we were dating, and I didn't realize that she was abusive, emotionally and psychologically abusive, until it was too late. But I was the director of a treatment program in town, and I was hanging out with this young girl that was really engaged in partying and having a good time, and I thought I was, being good by just not drinking and engaging in substance use with her. What I didn't realize is that she was encouraging me to drink, but she would say things subtly, like when I got home from work, she would say, "Well, you're really stressed out. Too bad you can't drink with me. Wow, that job's really stressful for you. Too bad you can't just have one drink." And she would say this day in and day out. And I didn't realize that she was trying to influence me. But 3 months after dating her, I started drinking again. And I'm not trying to put all the onus on her, but I was trying to draw a story here that I was looking for a solution externally for something internally that I wasn't addressing. So the degrees that I earned, even the wife that I had married at one point, the engagement in the community, the jobs, the job promotions, the rubbing elbows with leadership. And then after I pushed my wife away, chasing other women, starting to DJ again. I was looking for an external solution, and I was never really trying to tend to this woundedness that was feeding into and being fed into from this chaos from my childhood. And so I had cracked, and I had relapsed. In, I think it was let's see, I'm 44 now, so I was 37 years old. So this led to a 6-year period of me using drugs again and drinking alcohol. And finally, in 2022, after quite a few attempts of trying to get sober again, I was introduced to New Beginnings Recovery Center. It was actually a gal that had been working for my father for years, doing marketing things for her. Her niece had gone through this program before. And it was really interesting because my father had ended up getting his life back together. He had actually sobered up a couple of years before I relapsed. But at the time, he started building houses again at a much smaller scale, but his construction company was called New Beginnings, New Homes. And so he had the decal written on his truck, New Beginnings, in big blue letters. And one day, after struggling with me for months, trying to convince me to go to treatment to get help, he threw me in his truck, essentially, and drove me in his New Beginnings truck all the way to Denver to New Beginnings Treatment Center. And so, and a New Beginnings it was indeed. So I had gone through the program here, and of course I've fallen in love with the whole program. It was, not just from my professional experience, but my own personal experience. I unfortunately became an expert at rehabs because I had already been to 5 others before, or 6 others before, and this was by far the best program I had ever experienced. And, I felt home here. And I certainly couldn't, I had no business going back to Grand Junction. There was only broken bridges for me there. So I stayed here to try to make a life out of it here. But unfortunately for me, the one thing that was missing was this new phenomenon that I had to deal with when I got sober, and that was despite how amazing the program was and despite how much people were rooting for me, the amount of things that I had lost this time around, all the hard work that I put in those 5 years that I spent really convincing myself that I had this recovery thing down and that I understood what it was, I had lost everything within months of relapsing. So I lost my job. I lost my license to practice. I had to go to jail. I had gotten a 3rd DUI is what had happened, and I lost everything. And as a result of that, every time I tried to get sober over this last 3 years, I was punched in the face at the prospect of having to face all the loss that I had experienced and the mystery of what the future was going to hold for me, of what it would look like for me to have to build that back up and once again repair things, and once again repair things with people that I had hurt. And that shame and that guilt was staring me in the face every time I got sober. So I began to wrestle with this after going through treatment here. And I was working here at the center, but I started to disengage. And I started to isolate myself. And it's really hard to isolate yourself at MBRC Recovery Community. And, it's by design that we have a lot of opportunities to make sure that we're in community with each other. So I compartmentalized it emotionally. I compartmentalized it in my soul. That's where I was isolating. And I was just keeping myself at arm's distance because I was really hurting on the inside. And the hurt was from my own doing. It was this tremendous fear that I had of really having to look every time I had the opportunity to stare in the face all the loss and all the damage that I had caused in my life. That's what sobriety looked like for me. I didn't have that fire inside. I didn't have that hunger for it. But once again, crisis of identity, and I'm putting on a good show, and I'm really trying to hopefully let people believe that I'm doing okay, because I don't want to let them know that I'm hurting inside and that I'm lost inside. And so my disengagement from the community here led to me eventually relapsing. And rather than try to balance this, this plan for me to try to see if I could get away with it somehow, I ended up sabotaging once again everything that I had going for me here. And I respectfully gave my my notice, and I told Mary that I was going to go back home, and I believed that God was leading me to go, work for my dad and maybe one day take over his company, and I could be closer to my ex-wife, who's my ex-wife now, but wanting this prospect of rebuilding my marriage with her. So I convinced myself that the best solution for me in the face of this shame and in the face of this guilt, in the face of this fear, the prospect of trying to rebuild my life, that I pulled away from my safety net and from this second family that I had built here. And I ended up leaving, and I went back to Grand Junction. But all that really was Chris's one last performance. I had to give one last performance. So when I got back there, I started working for my dad again. But as soon as I could, I was on the phone with my plug trying to score crack cocaine. And I was letting my wife know. I was staying with my wife, living with my wife, and trying to convince her that I was still sober and just working hard for my dad and trying to make her believe that we were going to rebuild our lives together. But any time that she was at work and any time I had the place to myself, I was just using drugs. So that's what this 6-month period looked like for me. I'd go work for my dad. I'd lie to his face and tell him that I was sober. I'd lie to his face and tell him, oh yeah, I'm working on my recovery plan, Dad. And the same thing with my wife. And I would go home sometimes high as a kite with, a greasy face and wide black eyes, looking at my wife and telling her that I was sober. And that's what my life looked like for 6 months. And I thought that I was getting away with it. I thought that I was convincing everyone that I wasn't using. And I was living this lie. It was really interesting for me to think about it, though, that what was the cost of me thinking that I was getting away with it, living this illusion? So for 6 months, I lived this way, using drugs whenever I could, and then shaking it off and trying to live a functional life by working with my dad and lying to my dad and lying to my wife. Because every time I sobered up, I would see once again that prospect of what that future looked like, the fame. Just hang in with me, Romeo. We're almost there, buddy. The prospect of what it would look like for me to get out of this illusion that I was living and to try to build some kind of life for myself, and coming up with excuses that I'm no spring chicken anymore, and I'm not as young as I used to be, and I'm past the mark. I'm not going to be able to build any kind of life for myself. So this one of many times of using back in October, I did what I did, and I had my stuff with me in my car. I was driving my wife's car around, and I was getting high, driving around all day. And I had been drinking too, and she was up earlier than she normally is, and she was texting me to come home, and she was starting to get worried about me, and I thought, well, this is it. The jig is up. I'm going to go home. I'm high as a kite. I smell like alcohol. I'm not going to be able to gaslight my way out of this one. And I was driving around with a broken crack pipe in my hand, looking for a place to kill myself. Because I couldn't face my wife having to admit to her and having to bring the whole illusion down to the ground. So I was looking, it was broad daylight, and I was driving around. I drove to one corner. I was looking there. I was trying to make sure there were no kids around. I said, no, I can't do it there. I drove to a supermarket. I went over near a dumpster, and I was in the parking lot of the supermarket, and I ended up slicing my throat open with a broken crack pipe. And I laid down to die. It was going to be for me. But a family had seen me, and they were going grocery shopping, and they called the police, and I was put on a 72-hour hold, and I was sent to Centennial Peaks on a psych hold. And I got to learn all about the thing with the plastic sporks over there. And one of the first people I called was Mary, and I had asked her if I could come home, is basically what I had asked. And she took me back. And I came back into the treatment program back in October, and I knew something was different this time. What I had learned uh, maybe up to 2 weeks before I tried to take my life was that God was trying to show me something, and He was showing me something through all this chaos that was surrounding me. Because not only was I dealing with my loss, or what I call scarcity, and my fear of loss, and also this, abstract prospect of trying to regain a life and rebuild my life. And what did that look like? Did it look like what that 5 years of sobriety looked like? Did abundance look like degrees and job promotions and rubbing elbows with community stakeholders? I was watching my dad operate in this way too sometimes, because he wants to retire, and he wants to make enough so that he can retire and he doesn't have to build houses anymore, and he's wrestling with this fear of scarcity and this hope for abundance. And through that I saw there's got to be a place where scarcity and loss and this abundance, even materialistically, intersects into something that doesn't go anywhere. It has no beginning and it has no end. There's nothing to lose and there's nothing to gain, but just in the infinity of it is this point, the singularity of enough, where it's enough. And God was trying to teach me that it didn't matter the pain that my parents and the violence my parents brought in genetically into my life as a child, and the chaos that I had to go through, and the times my family's fallen apart, and the times I built families, and the times that I lost those again, that none of that mattered. All the scarcity and all the abundance I had hoped for, all the material things I had lost and I hoped to one day gain again. But something that really had some staying power, something that didn't have a beginning or an end, was that not less than enough and not more than enough, but just being enough. And that was what God was trying to tell me this whole time. And that was the biggest wake-up call that I had ever had, to be able to bring that, regardless of how old I am now, and regardless of the hard work that's ahead of me, to understand and to have to remind myself still sometimes daily that I am enough, despite what I've been through, despite what I've lost. And how beautiful that I get an opportunity to share that with you all today too. That, it might not be your epiphany today, and it's still something that I have to, seek engagement with, and to remind myself, I don't have perfect days every day. I still got to deal with the crap in between my ears on a daily basis. But that regardless of it, regardless of my fears, regardless of not knowing maybe what tomorrow might bring, that I'm enough and I'm worthy because by the virtue of the fact that I exist today. And God gave me that life. God gave me that gift. So, thank you for letting me share today. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. You know what I'm saying? So.
All right, before we get out of here, I'm just going to have a few people just with maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll wrap it up. I know you guys got to get back to the center. So does anybody have any questions? None.
So I know you're a musician, and I just want to say, because I can relate to a lot of your story, and how much relapse is important to learn from that in the future. But do you see yourself going forward in music as well, in the future, and maintaining that as part of your recovery as well?
Absolutely. I'm still, I still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. But music's definitely going to continue to be a big part of that. Absolutely.
Anybody else? Well, I would just like to say it was like I've seen you, I've met you since 22, and you've been a part of the New Beginnings in and out since then, and you have grown, and we've grown together, and you have a lot to offer, and you don't need this validation, but I just want for you to know it to be true that Mary and so many other people believe in you. And you're unique. I mean, your mind is kind of abstract, dude, and it really works differently. I'm a real simple guy, but what a joy it is to listen to you and your story and what you had to say, and you're nothing short of a miracle. And there was people walking by there on purpose, for a purpose, for you to tell this story today, for you to maybe possibly just touch one person in here. And to change this person's life where something might go, where you get it, that you might walk something different. And so I thank you for that. I thank you for sharing, and I thank you for just kind of letting it all out. And because a lot of people get up there and they hold back, and I think that's the real you, what you spoke today. And we appreciate you being the real epic you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
So without further ado, Chris, he puts all these things together for the testimonies. And it says, Chris Lawrence, the classic epic story of how, let me see here, he tuned out of his addiction and choreographed his new life.
That's awesome.
Just a little something. Mary, you got anything, Mary?